And for the third and final time, we ask the same question. I am divorced and remarried. Am I living in adultery? Hi, welcome to today's little lesson. Once again, for the third time, we're looking at divorce and remarriage. Is that adultery in God's eyes? And should Christian couples who realize that because they've been formally married and divorced, should they then get a divorce and, if possible, get back to their previous spouse, because in God's eyes they're still married to that person? That's really the question that we're addressing. Well, I can understand how folks can come up with that idea based upon Jesus's words about whoever divorces and marries another commits adultery. But to take the most strict literal interpretation of those words, it would seem to be foolish in light of other evidence from Scripture. I mean, Jesus said right at one of those same passages where he mentions what I've just said, whoever divorces and marries another commits adultery. He said, if your eye cause you to stumble, pluck it out. And if your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. Well, no one takes him in the strictest literal sense there. They look for the real meat of what he's trying to get across. And what he's trying to get across is, if there's something that's causing you to stumble, cut it off. Of course, your physical eye and your physical hand can't actually cause you to stumble, and so it'd be foolish to try to remedy your situation that way. I heard a guy say one time, the lustful man who plucks out his one eye, that doesn't solve his problem. Now he's just a one-eyed luster. Because lust is something that's in the mind and in the heart. That's where you got to adjust, and you got to cut off the temptations and the things that would cause you to stumble into that. All right, so there's other things. There's so many things that Jesus said that nobody takes in their strictest literal sense, and it's obvious that the apostles didn't take Jesus on these words in their strictest literal sense, because there's no place in the New Testament where you could read about any apostles telling people to divorce, much less telling Christians to divorce because they've been previously, divorced prior to their salvation or sometime in the past. It's just not found outside of a very strict literal interpretation of those 4 divorce and remarriage passages that the Synoptic Gospel writers recorded. Okay, now this subject deserves more time, and I have written an article that's on our website, davidservant.com. The title of it is, I'm divorced and remarried, am I living in adultery? So if you just type something similar to that in the search bar, you'll come up with it, and you'll see that I've addressed all the objections and so forth. Probably the biggest death blow to that idea is the fact that Paul contradicts it in his letter to the Corinthians, his first letter to the Corinthians. He's got a whole chapter there that's all about marriage and divorce and widowhood and immorality and what's right and what's wrong and divorce and so forth. And never once does Paul intimate that anybody should be divorcing anybody. He tells Christians emphatically, don't divorce. And if you don't listen to me and you do separate, remain single or else be reconciled. And then he tells Christians who are married to unbelievers, don't divorce. And if the unbelieving one is willing to stay, stick it out. Maybe you can win them, But he says if they want to go, let them go. You're not under bondage in such cases, okay? Now, I'm going to read a passage in the time we have left as part of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that shows you, unequivocally, Paul did not buy into the divine divorce doctrine that's being promulgated in some circles today. 1 Corinthians 7, verse number 24, brethren, each one is to remain with God in that condition in which he was called. And that's kind of summarizing a number of verses in front of that I'm not reading, but it's basically stay where you're at. Verse 25, now concerning virgins, those are people who have obviously never been married, never had a sexual relationship with somebody. I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. I think then that this is good in view of the present distress, that is good for a man to remain as he is. There's that same theme, remaining as you are. And the present distress could only have been some wave of persecution that's, passing through. And of course, persecution does generally come in waves. It ebbs and it flows. And so Paul's saying right now, better just, if you're a virgin, I wouldn't be thinking about marriage right now. Not a good time to think about marriage. And then he says in verse number 27, and this is kind of a summary of lots of things he's been saying. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Well, of course, he's already said over and over again, you shouldn't be seeking a divorce. You shouldn't be seeking to get out of your marriage. Are you released from a wife? He now asks, do not seek a wife. And that fits the advice he's just told to virgins. But now he's saying it to those who have been divorced. Are you released from a wife? You had a wife, you're released. Don't seek a wife. It's better just, at least right now, to be single. But now listen to verse number 28, addressed to the person who he's just been addressing. Are you released from a wife? Here's what he says. But if you marry, you have not sinned. That certainly is the death blow to the idea that you are sinning and living in adultery if you are previously married, divorced, and now remarried. Right? Now, of course, divorce always involves sin, right? I mean, come on. There's got to be selfishness in one or the other or both that drove people to a divorce. Because when they got married, they loved each other. They were expecting till death do us part. That's what they said. That was the promise they gave. But they let selfishness enter in, and, I'm not going to point my finger at anybody. I'm just going to say that we all agree that when there's a divorce, there's sin. It doesn't please God. God never intended, but he made provision for it because he knew that it was probably inevitable in light of the hardness of people's hearts. And so remarriage, under the old covenant, divorced women were allowed to get remarried, and Israelite men were allowed to marry divorced women. The only exception were priests. Okay, that's the old covenant. That's the Mosaic law. New covenant is the same here. If you marry, you have not sinned. Now, some will say, well, but how do you know? How are you sure that he's talking to the person who's been released from a wife? Because in the next clause of the same verse, he says, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Okay, so clearly when he says, but if you marry, you have not sinned, he's not talking about the person who's never been married. He's talking about the person who has been married and has been released from a wife. All right, so you can study this out yourself. We've devoted 3 little lessons to it, and these are little lessons. Again, go to davidservant.com and look up the article that's titled, I'm divorced and remarried, am I living in adultery? If you want more information and explanation. Okay, hey, thank you so much for joining me on this little lesson. Hope to see you next time.